Members, we will now move to convening the second extraordinary session. Without objection, we will substitute the prayer, pledge, and other opening procedures in the regular session for those items in the second extraordinary session. Members, we are moving to AB 15. The clerk will read.
Assembly Bill 15 by Assemblymember Eggman and others, an act relating to end of life.
Dr. Eggman, you may open.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. I am very pleased to have the opportunity to present to you today Assembly Bill X215. This bill is the product of an immense amount of work across both houses involving many legislators, close collaboration with stakeholders. The result, members, is the most rigorous and aid in dying legislation in the country with the strongest set of protections for patients and the physicians who treat them. At its most basic, this bill provides the option for a person who is terminally ill to request a prescription for medication to aid in their passing in their last days. This bill requires that in order to qualify, a person must have a terminal illness. It requires that the request be voluntary and only the qualifying person may request the drug. They have to request the medication 3 times. One time in writing, 15 days after the first verbal request, and finally through a written request that is witnessed by 2 people. Of those 2 witnesses, only one may be a family member and only one may be an employee of the healthcare facility. The person who requests the drug must have the physical and mental capacity to take it themselves. The attending physician must refer the person if there are any indications of a mental disorder, which would be a disqualifying factor pending an evaluation by a mental health specialist. All of those criteria are to be evaluated by the attending physician, who doesn't count as a witness to the request, and must also let the patient know that when they get the drug, they are under no obligation to take it. They may cancel the request at any time they want, and they must also detail for them all feasible treatment alternatives, including hospice care. Crucially, participation in the End of Life Option Act is voluntary for patients, for physicians, and for healthcare providers. Healthcare coverage can be neither offered nor denied based on a person's choice to participate in the End of Life Act. And what doesn't it do, members? We've heard a lot of fears, but what doesn't it do? What it won't do is everything the opposition has tried to scare people with. That is all people often have, is fear and confusion and distraction. Distraction from the simple truth that they don't oppose the bill only in the most implausible worst-case scenarios that they describe. They oppose this practice in any case. They oppose a person with an advanced terminal illness, in great pain, in full control of their decisions, deciding to take this option. What it will do is provide a measure of freedom to people who are dying to do so in a way that is medically sound, under the treatment and supervision of a physician whose interest is in their living. That choice is everyone's to make for themselves. And that is fundamentally what this bill is about, what I stand for, and hopefully, members, what we can all stand for today. I ask for your aye vote.
Thank you, Dr. Eggman. Ms. Brown, you are recognized. I'm sorry, point of order.
Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Gallagher, state your point of order.
This bill is not properly before this extraordinary session, as it is not consistent with the purpose stated for the extraordinary session, which is healthcare funding. This bill has nothing to do with funding healthcare and Medi-Cal.
Mr. Gallagher, the Rules Committee referred this bill pursuant to Assembly rules. It is germane to healthcare. That point of order is not well taken. Ms. Brown. I'm sorry. Mr. Gallagher, I've ruled on the point of order.
I vote on the ruling.
I'm sorry?
I call for a vote on the ruling, a vote of the House.
You're appealing the decision of the chair?
Appealing the decision of the chair.
Okay.
My apologies.
You have 2 minutes to present. That requires a second, Mr. Gallagher, on the appeal.
Again, members, it's appropriate that we follow the procedures that we...
Mr. Gallagher, this requires a second. Seconded by Mr. Wilk. Mr. Gallagher, you have 2 minutes to present your thoughts on the appeal.
Mr. Speaker, members, again, and I will be brief, it's important that we follow the procedures established for this body. This extraordinary session was called for the specific purpose of finding funding for Medi-Cal and other health care issues for the developmentally disabled. This bill is not consistent with the subject of this extraordinary session. And I think it's incumbent upon all of us to ensure that we follow proper procedure. This bill did go through in our regular session, and it didn't make it through the committee process. We need to respect that decision and the decision that was made in Health Committee and not allow the rules to be circumvented. And so I would encourage all of you to overrule this ruling so that we can get back to the business that we've been working on and that we can get back to the proper business of this extraordinary session. Thank you.
Mr. Gallagher, as I indicated, the Rules Committee properly referred this bill. It's germane to health. I have cited my reasoning in my decision on your point of order. The question before the body is a procedural one, and it is, should the ruling of the chair be upheld? This is procedural, members. The clerk will open the roll. Mr. Holden is asking for an aye vote. Mr. Gallagher is asking for a no vote. Mr. Holden is asking for an aye vote. Mr. Gallagher is asking for a no vote. This requires a majority of those present and voting. Requires a majority of those present and voting. Clerk will close the roll. Ayes 41, noes 28. The ruling of the chair is upheld. Ms. Brown, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, members. This is a sad time. I must rise in opposition to this measure by my friend from Stockton, friend and colleague. I just have to tell you the stories in my life. Mr. Floyd Brown had pancreatic cancer, was given 6 months to live. Came home, family had to come. 6 months later, he didn't die. 8 years later, after he had become a minister of the gospel, the Lord saw fit to take him home. That's one of my stories. My son, Hardy Brown Jr., had a broken leg, was reset, had fatty emboli. Doctor said he can't live. Doctors took me into a room and said, he can't live. Why don't you just give up? I believe in the power of prayer. Said, I'm not giving up on my son. 19 days later, my son came off of life support, and our son is alive today. He has a family, he has my grandchildren, and he's doing very well. My mother, Melba Mentor, who helped to get many folks that served in this house elected, she was 6 months on hospice because they said she can't make it. 6 months later, they took her off of hospice. But that experience showed me that doctors don't know everything. And now my husband, Hardy Brown Sr., he was diagnosed with ALS in 2002. They said, take him home, 3 to 5 years, he will be gone, and it's going to be this horrible death. Mr. Kevorkian was taking people in and saying, you know, the death is so terrible that you just need to kill yourself. Hardy Brown has seen his grandchildren, his great-grandchildren. He has been a model in the community. I'm here because of him. Had he listened and had he done what this bill wants him to do, he would not be here, and neither would I be in this house. What about those in the disability community? In the disability community, I can see someone coming in and saying, you know, your disability is so bad, why don't you just take this pill and leave us? What about the senior citizens, the silver tsunami that I talk about? They're going to challenge the system. California doesn't need this. We don't need this. And I ask for a no vote.
Thank you, Ms. Brown. Mr. Rendon, you are recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. I rise in strong support for the end-of-life option, and I would like to commend the author who has listened carefully and amended this bill in response to members' concerns. Full end-of-life options are an urgent need for dying Californians who need relief. These Californians do not have another legislative session to wait for us on this floor to act. They have entrusted us, and so we should act to provide them all with options. This bill does not interfere with faith. This bill is about choice. That is why I urge you today to support the End-of-Life Option Act, to allow mentally competent, terminally ill adults the option to choose to die with dignity and pain-free. I ask for your aye vote.
Thank you, Mr. Rendon. Mr. David Chu, you are recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. First of all, I want to start by acknowledging all the many conversations we've all had about this difficult decision. I think we've all struggled with what is a vote of conscience for all of us. As the son of a doctor and as someone who went to Catholic school, I greatly respect the diversity of opinions we have on this. That being said, after years of debate on this issue, I think the time has come for compassion. There have been a lot of arguments that have been raised in opposition to this measure, and I want to respond to some of them. There are some who suggest that this bill is about suicide. I disagree. This bill is not about suicide. This bill does not affect those who are choosing between living and dying. It's about providing an option to those who are already facing death. There are some who say that we don't know what's going to happen. And the fact of the matter is, we have already seen 5 states who have moved forward with measures like this, including the state of Oregon, who for almost 2 decades have not seen a single incident of abuse. There are some who say there are not enough protections in this bill. We've heard from our colleague from Stockton the numerous protections. 2 doctors required to confirm prognoses of 6 months or less, written requests that are required, 2 oral requests that are required to be at least 15 days apart, 2 witnesses that attest, doctors that have to ensure that a person has the capacity to make a decision, him or herself. And there's some who say that we need more time to deliberate this measure. And I would suggest 2 things. First of all, this issue, we know, will be decided by the state of California, if not by this body, by a ballot measure next year. And from my perspective, I think a ballot measure is the wrong approach. There is overwhelming support for this measure in the state of California. If a ballot measure passes, we won't be able to change it if we need to change 1 word of that language. But I think more importantly, we know that every day there are hundreds of Californians who are suffering. And in an ideal world, we wouldn't have a need to move forward with this measure, but the sad truth is we don't, and we need to give those who wish to pass peacefully in their final days the option to maintain their dignity. I hope we can vote for compassion, and as a co-author of this bill, I ask for your support.
Mr. Gibson, you're recognized from your desk.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and to the members and to the author. I struggle with this bill in a number of different ways. It's not easy for me to stand here today voting on this particular bill. This bill really cuts across a number of different emotional issues for me. As my colleague, Ms. Member Brown, has indicated, I have seen so many miraculous turnaround in people's lives when the doctors have given up, when the doctors have said, do funeral arrangements, and then the prognosis changed in a matter of moments, in a matter of hours. A school board member here in the city of Compton was diagnosed with stage 4 cancer. I left Palm Springs and I went right to her hospital room on Father's Day. The doctor's already given up. Cancer throughout in her entire body. When we left after we prayed, the prognosis started turning around. It baffled the doctors. They gave her 6 months to live. She lived 4.5 years after that prognosis, or should I say diagnosis. This bill talks about a prognosis. It's not absolute. I'm simply saying that we should respect people to live their life. My father, who had cancer, October 13th, 2013, had cancer. Not a day of struggling, not a day of moaning. I know that's my daddy. I know that his particular situation may be different from other people's, and I get that. But you know what? For me to allow him, every moment that my father was in my life, whether he did what I want him to do or not, and I'm just being real, every moment I cherished it. And guess what? I told my father everything that I wanted to tell him that I couldn't tell him before he went to the hospital. And I had that opportunity to walk my father to the gates of heaven. And he stepped over and I said goodbye. And that gave me the consolation and the peace to let him go. And I know that every family member struggles differently when it comes down to their loved one dying. I realize that. But I'm simply saying that, is this the right way? In my community, which I serve, we have a number of faith-based organizations and individuals I have heard from. They've said, no, I will vote my district, I will vote my conscience. And I would ask that you do the same thing. There's a member right now, and I won't mention that individual's name, whose staff person, they gave 3 days to live. This person is on the 12th day right now, and she's still living. And the family member said to me that we won't allow her just to go in a hospital and die. We're going to let her stay right home, stay right here, and give her everything that she needs. And I respect that family's wishes. Members, I'm asking you, and I'm going to conclude by saying, vote your conscience. Vote for the miracles that I believe that takes place each and every day. Each and every day. I'm not going to give up. I'm not going to give up. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Gibson. Ms. Garcia, you are recognized.
Members, I rise in strong support of this measure. I'm a Catholic, not just because I grew up in a Catholic home, but because I believe in God and His ability to guide me in times of uncertainty. In fact, I drop by the cathedral on K Street on a regular basis to thank God for all His blessings and opportunities He has granted me, including the opportunity to sit here on this floor with you today. Many times I go looking for guidance in performing my duties as a legislator because we have a huge responsibility and it can be daunting on a regular basis. Until today, I've never wanted to share this practice with anyone in the Capitol community because I prefer to keep my relationship with my religion and God private. Not because I'm ashamed of it, far from it. Religion can and is a beautiful thing, but because I wanted to protect it and not open it to interpretation from others. As a Catholic who is also a public servant, I know that my job allows me to practice my faith, but I have a responsibility not to impose my faith on others. Moreover, I have a responsibility to ensure we create a space where people can practice whatever beliefs or faith they have, even if they are contrary to mine. I know that some of my Catholic peers in this body are struggling with this bill. I want them to know that this bill is drafted in such a way you can continue to practice your faith without imposing it on those who do not practice the same faith with you. In fact, this bill has protections for hospitals or doctors who don't want to offer these services. This bill simply allows individuals to be free to follow their own beliefs and leaves the final decision to be made between a patient and their doctors, because together they know better than any of us what is best for them. I respectfully ask that you join me in giving Californians the right to make a decision for themselves as they face death and vote aye for this measure.
Thank you, Ms. Garcia. Mr. Stone, you are recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, we are at a point in history right now as we make this decision. This notion is coming to California, and it's our process or it's the ballot process that will decide it. And if you look at how this bill has been crafted, it has been very, very carefully crafted to take into account all the perspectives we've been hearing on the floor today. It is not a bill that would allow for coercion. It is not a bill that would allow for someone else making a decision about someone's personal decision about their own death. That's what's paramount about this bill. It's a conversation between the individual who's dying and their doctor and a consulting physician to make sure that there's a clear diagnosis, because it is true, diagnoses are not always accurate. There are times, we all know people who have lived longer than the diagnosis, and we know people who have lived shorter than the diagnosis. But the real issue is who's making the decision about someone's own end of life, and whether it is being influenced externally or truly internally. This bill has built-in provisions to make sure that it is the individual who is making their own decision about their own death who has the last say, and not someone from the outside saying, oh, it would be more convenient for you not to be here. Are we going to be talking to our own family members about their death and how it affects us, and that drives the conversation, which is typically how we've done it in our culture? We are so afraid of death and talking about death that we're not willing to face it with a loved one who's going through the dying process and making that decision. And in that case, I will submit to you that we are reacting to their death for our own benefit, not for the benefit of the individual who's dying. This is a bill that puts in the hands of the individual who's going through that process of dying a choice. What the record shows us out of states that have already adopted this law is fully a third of the people who get the prescription don't take it. And most don't take it right away, which allows that longer conversation, allows the thoughtfulness of the individual, but it also gives them the comfort to know that they have some modicum of control as they're going through the dying process. That's what's important about this bill. It is not externally imposed, it is entirely internally imposed. And that's what has been strongly negotiated in this House. Remarkably, the Medical Association in California is not opposing this bill, as they do across the country, because we've put in place protections. We've put in place the decision for the individual who is going through the process of dying. That is what is so important here. Look to your constituents, look to your thoughts, but look across California and see who is telling us to take action. 65 to 70% of Californians are asking us to take action. And the protections built into this bill for that individual who is dying are the most important thing we could do here today. So don't think of yourself when you think of a loved one dying. Think of that loved one dying and the choice that they want to make for themselves. And I urge an aye vote.
Thank you, Mr. Stone. Mr. Quirk, you are recognized.
Thank you, Speaker and members. I stand in strong support of this bill. I have had several relatives with terminal diagnoses. I had a sister who was told that she had 6 months to live. She decided to go in for all the chemotherapy, have a great year. She did have a great year. She had just had a baby, spent that time with her baby. That was what she wanted to do, and she did it. And she did it, the chemotherapy, while it was a problem, was bearable. She did not have unbearable pain. Some people have unbearable pain. Some people, if they're given a week to live and they had 6 months, it would be a curse, not a favor, because they are living in pain. This bill is about making choices to have the kind of life you want to have. A life lived in pain is not bearable for some people. We want to give them an option. So my sister made the decision to do everything that needed to be done to live another year. My mom had Alzheimer's. She couldn't make a decision for herself. However, with Alzheimer's and as old as she was and having had strokes and heart attacks, we knew she didn't have a long time. But for many years, those years were healthy for her. She went along. My sister and I spent time with her. They were good years. But then we got to the point where she no longer understood what was going on around her, where we would give her a blood pressure cuff and take her blood pressure, and she'd say, "You're killing me, you're killing me." We'd try and get her a blood sample and so that she would know how much Coumadin she should be on. It was just too much for her. So we made the decision to put her in hospice so she could have a good next 6 months, not necessarily a bad year or two. We wanted that good 6 months for my mom. So we put her in hospice, and she was suddenly so much better. She'd gotten to the point where she was counting all the time. Here is your 85-year-old mother with Alzheimer's, and about the only thing she'll say is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. We gave her a better life. She started talking to us. She responded to us. It was a good 6 months, much better than a couple of years in agony. Thank you.
Ms. Waldron, you are recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. I rise on opposition to AB 2X15. As a member of Assembly Health, this bill never came to us. We never saw it in Health. It wasn't vetted through our normal process for whatever reasons. So it did not survive that process. And as our colleagues have already stated, we know, all of us know people who have been given 6 months and they go on 10 years of quality life. So, what our healthcare practitioners can see at the moment isn't always what's actually going on. With new developments in drugs, new technologies, we can keep people alive with a better quality of life. One of the things, too, is situations are going to arise. People will be offered the cheaper, lethal prescription rather than the costlier treatment. Those without financial resources, the poor, those on Medi-Cal, the disabled, the lower income working class, they don't have the ability to see the higher price psychologist or get a better health care. They'll be subjected to this de facto health care rationing. And while it sounds lofty, removing the liability on all involved does not protect the patient. The family has no recourse to go back on those who are involved. It sounds great. Oh, yeah, the doctor can do it, but they won't be held liable. Well, who is held liable? Undermining the positive gains in hospice and palliative care, suicide should not be the first option when hospice and palliative care has not been tried. I think back on my family. Who wants to see their loved ones suffer? This is an emotional debate, but we can't make a decision based on emotion. We're talking about people's lives, and what we do right here could undermine so much that could come out in positive. Lastly, this is emotional. While there may not be physical healing, and this is one thing I've said after my father-in-law died on a machine, God does tremendous spiritual healing in the final days. Forgiveness, reconciliation, conversion, family members coming together, time standing still. The important things are the things that rise to the top, not our rushing around all the time. We realize what's really important. This bill would cut off this healing because we see dimly. Only the Creator can bring the necessary spiritual healing in His perfect time. I urge a no vote.